This episode of New Politics was released on the 21st of December, 2024, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Welcome to New Politics. 2025 is the year of the snake, and it's also the year of the next federal election, so we take out our crystal ball and try to work out what's likely to happen. I'm Eddie Djokovic, editor of New Politics.
I'm David Lewis, with a solemn reminder that at Christmas time, it's not the size of the gift, it's how much it cost.
And just our regular message, listen in, share, subscribe and support New Politics at Patreon and Substack, or you can donate at our website at newpolitics.com.au. And of course, all of this is a good way to support independent journalism.
Here it is. Here it is. Here it is. Here it is.
Are you looking for it? You'll hear it from me.
2025 is going to be an election year, and after all the media-driven speculation that the election was going to be held in August 2024, and then September, October, and then November, and I think there was also some talk about the election being held in late December. Not sure how that was going to work, but the next election is definitely going to be held in 2025. It's just that we don't know when, but it's likely to be in May, and we've been consistently saying that for pretty much the past year. The leftover themes from 2024 are still likely to be relevant in 2025, and that's the economy, interest rates, cost of living, housing, and there's all those peripheral issues related to the economy. And as Bill Clinton said all those years ago, it's the economy, stupid. And that's probably going to be the big issue for this next election as well. And the year ended with the Liberal National Coalition ahead in the opinion polls at 51% in the two-party preferred vote to Labor's 49%. And the point is that even 5 or 6 months out from an election, these numbers don't really actually mean that much. The electorate isn't really focused on the election and won't start doing that until the election is called. But this overall, in my opinion, is not a terrible position for the Labor government to be in. And for me, there doesn't seem to be a mood for change in the electorate. And if it's fairly even in the opinion polls just 6 months out, well, that's not too bad for an incumbent government, based on the way that all the seats were positioned after the 2022 federal election. But there are other issues to consider. A Labor government hasn't run a campaign from within government for over 11 years, so they might be a little bit out of practice there. And while incumbency usually provides great advantages for a government, we've seen that in recent years that this might not be the advantage that it might have been in the past. And we also have to remember that this seems to be a Labor government that is not very good at political management and never misses an opportunity to miss an opportunity. But either way, elections are not won 6 months out from an election. There's still some time to go, but there's still also a lot of work to be done.
I suppose an election could be lost 6 months out, but that requires something of immense catastrophe, like going on holidays during the worst national crisis since World War II, for example. And the government, for all its many faults and mistakes and poor policy choices, is relatively stable and is not completely incompetent, unlike the last few governments, none of which were overburdened by competence, I think it's fair to say. As I said last week, the Liberal Party under Peter Dutton has very little chance of winning. The one path they have is almost impossible. If they win it, I'd be not quite surprised. I'm probably a bit more impressed, because it needs some of the characteristics that Peter Dutton doesn't seem to have. A charismatic, likeable leader going to those particular seats and really working them hard. I don't think he can swing enough voters. That will, of course, depend on the government's performance over the next 6 months.
And elections are not just about the performance of the government in the past. It's also about the expectations about what they will provide for the future. And just looking at history, all first-term governments since 1931 have been re-elected. And I'm not suggesting that this will happen again just because of history, and history can always change. And David, as a historian, you would know that very, very well. But just that first-term governments have always found a way of winning that first re-election and returning to office. And some supporters of the government have been suggesting that in opinion polls, the Labor Party is currently polling at the same level of primary vote as the last election, and that was 32.6% of the primary vote. So that means that everything should be okay and the Albanese government will be returned. But it's never that simple with politics. Every election is different. And we could have a situation where Labor could increase its primary vote at the next election and lose the election, and conversely, its primary vote could actually be lower than that 32.6% that it received at the 2022 election and still win the election. It's just the vagaries of the two-party preferential voting system that we have, and that's what this election will come down to, preferences. And that's how it always is. And preferences is another reason why I think it was quite stupid of the Labor government to attack the Australian Greens so much, especially for most of this year. But the other issue is that people can be annoyed about a particular government but still vote them back in, because it's always a relative contest and all you have to do is be better than your opponent. And are people angry enough with Anthony Albanese to throw the Labor government out of office? You know, that's always possible, but is it likely? That's always got to be the question. And who wins in a contest between Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton? You know, Peter Dutton is a divisive wrecker and he's got racist attributes, as did Tony Abbott, but that didn't stop him from becoming Prime Minister. So it always comes down to the political skills that are shown and used during an election campaign, but it's still unlikely for the Liberal National Coalition to make up enough ground at the next election. They could, but I'm just saying that this will be quite difficult. And there is a bit of a litmus test before the federal election, and in March there is the Western Australian state election, and the Liberal Party will pick up seats after that anomaly of the 2021 state election where the Labor Party won 53 of the 59 seats over there. That's not going to happen again. That is definitely not sustainable. So there will be a natural political correction there. But we know how all of this will be played out in the media quite predictably, that it's all doom and gloom for the Labor Party or the WA Labor government, and when all it's doing is really a return to more historical voting patterns in Western Australia. So I don't think it's so much a case about whether Labor wins or not in the West Australian state election, because they'd have to lose something like 25 seats to lose office, and I just cannot see that happening. They will lose some seats in that natural correction, but I just can't see them losing that many. But I think overall the election results in Western Australia will give some indication to Anthony Albanese about how many federal seats the Labor government might lose in Western Australia at the federal level. And the WA Liberal Party branch is quite disorganised at the moment, and they've only got 2 lower house seats over there in the state parliament. But still there might be some seats that would be of concern to Anthony Albanese at the federal level, and he might be doing quite a few trips over to Western Australia over the next few months to shore up a bit of support.
I think that they lost very, very big in Western Australia for very, very good reasons. And the electorate can have a very short memory, but it can also have a very long memory. And I don't think the Liberal Party learned the lessons of why they lost so many seats. So, the choice is, do you go over and maybe win 1 or 2 seats? They're not going to get 12 or 13 or whatever they lost. Anything from here is a long game. And in this election where I think the Liberal Party knows that it's really got to sandbag what it's got, and there are more winnable seats, I don't think they're going to win back any teal seats while the current candidates are in. And the amount of people who forget that one of the essential part of the colour teal is blue, which is the colour of the Liberal Party, which is why they're called teals. So you have people who have a broad agreement with their electorate and who were mostly traditional Liberal voters. And most people focus on the green. and forget about the blue. The Liberal Party's resources are right down. They're falling membership. They've got donors who are not sure if the Liberal Party will get back in. Against that, they've got people like Gina Reinhardt who are going to prop it up as much as they possibly can. I wonder when it'll get to the point where even Gina Reinhardt will think this is just throwing good money after bad and find other candidates like Clive Palmer did, although that didn't work.
And leadership is going to be very important at the next election, and that's, well, I'm just stating the bleeding obvious there, but the leadership of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has definitely suffered over the last year. He's still the preferred Prime Minister in the final opinion polls of the year, but that to me is not saying much when the candidate is Peter Dutton. He's as unpopular as Peter Dutton, and both leaders have almost got the same net approval rating, which is around -12 for both of them. So it appears that they are both equally disliked, albeit for different reasons. But I think it just gets back to some of those issues that we've discussed throughout the year, that sense of disappointment, that there were expectations that this Labor government and the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, would have been reformists like the Whitlam government or the Hawke government, but just hasn't come anywhere near that. So it's a question of what will be different during 2025 for Anthony Albanese, and I think a lot has to change as far as the leadership and performance of the leader is concerned. This Labor government has actually been quite woeful at politics, and actual performance and political management are two key parts of a successful government. And Labor has generally been good, more or less, in performance, but hopeless at the politics. And I think that's what really needs to improve for 2025.
Yeah. Well, Labor's, most of its history, it has prioritised ideal over pragmatism, notably not in the 1980s and 90s with the rise of the Ferals, that New South Wales faction who included Bob Carr, Paul Keating, Graham Richardson, Laurie Brereton, I think, who were masterful politicians. And it was interesting that once their influence had waned a little bit, another masterful politician in John Howard was able to become Prime Minister. And there's a sense in which the politics are much more important than the ideology. Graham Richardson's Whatever It Takes is really a manual in how to use the politics to get ahead. And if you do it properly, you also get good policy. Now, I know that Richardson is now anathema to many Labor voters for good reason. But at the time, he was genuinely a numbers man. Ben Chifley had his numbers people, and they worked out what was worth doing by counting the numbers. If you didn't have the support, you didn't go through with it. You rethought how to do it, so you got the support. The Albanese government seems to get the policy, go forward, not get the numbers, and be stuck. It's maybe an issue of trying to slow down a bit.
Oh, but I guess on that point, all of their legislation that they wanted to introduce during this parliamentary term has already been introduced. So parliamentary numbers and the way that Parliament performs over the next 6 months probably isn't going to be that crucial. It's more about political performance outside of Parliament that's going to be quite critical.
It's not just about winning question time, which the Abbott through Morrison governments thought. By degrading question time, they might have won on points, but they ultimately lost because they didn't use question time for what it's supposed to be used for, which is to defend the government's record, to explain to the public what's going on, to make sure that everybody knew what was going on, to shape policy in a sense, and to show how much better they are than the opposition was at governing. Question time is now about scoring political points without actually giving any substance to it. And I think that's part of that is due to the last few governments' malaises. There's a particular procedure you follow, and that's how Parliament becomes the pinnacle of Australian political life, not through being rabble and scoring points that ultimately get you nowhere, but by achieving substantial policy aims and policy goals and making things better. Now, I know making things better is a big phrase, and we have at least 5 parties that have a different view of what makes things better. But if you don't do that, why are you there?
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, the best podcast on Australian politics and news commentary. You can support us through Patreon and Substack, and also find us at newpolitics.com.au.
Tunes on, oh loud, I wanna see what you make me do, and how I know you think it may be too soon. Come round and show me what you got. I heard you wanna be in the driver's seat, so keep up. And do you promise me that you'll honor me? Don't give up.
And just looking at the Liberal Party leadership, Peter Dutton has certainly got the Liberal Party back into the game. It's still not enough to win the election at this stage, but it is competitive. And I think this gets back to Albanese just not playing the political game hard enough and trying to be the statesman and polite and bipartisan with Dutton when he should have put the foot down and stamped him right out. And I think Anthony Albanese might come to rue this, like a lot of other decisions that he's made as well, or a lot of other strategies that he's employed. But Peter Dutton hasn't really got much to offer on the policy front. Oppositions generally don't need to do too much in this area, but so far it's just been all noise and nothing else. Anti-woke, following a racist agenda, attacking renewable energy, promoting nuclear energy, and it's very similar to the agenda of Gina Rinehart and all of those other right-wingers in the mining industry. It's negative, it's divisive, but it has actually got him to where he is now, in that competitive position. But I think that this probably just means that this behaviour is going to continue over the next 6 months. It's got him to where he is now, so why would he change that? But it just means that the next election could end up being one of the worst in Australia's history.
What it does, of course, is allow people to think that by being racist, by being sexist, by being ableist, by being ageist, by being generally offensive, that they are somehow owning the libs, or as the Americans say, stopping woke culture from spreading, without really understanding what woke culture is, and without really understanding outside their own little view of the world, that they're not interested in looking past. And this gives people permission not to look outside themselves. My view is that if it's going to hurt somebody, why do it? And I think a lot of us on the, I'll call it the progressive side, try and do no harm, as the Hippocratic Oath says. It's easy to not use racist or ageist or transphobic or sexist or whatever slurs. It's a bit harder to not bring in entrenched language. But if you're aware of it, and it makes you a bit more thoughtful and it makes you a bit more aware of the world, this is a good thing. But there are people who don't want to be challenged by other worldviews and would rather shut themselves out. When Peter Dutton gives you permission to be racist, to be sexist, to be transphobic, to be homophobic, to be ageist, to be ableist, to be anti-Muslim, anti the other, it releases people from the responsibility of responsibility. Rights are important, but rights have responsibilities, and people don't want that. And responsibilities, or the lack of responsibilities, have consequence. And if people can get away with not having consequence, they're very happy. It's why we have the Ten Commandments, the Bhagavad Gita, the Magna Carta, the American Declaration of Independence, and thousands of other documents. It's to try and remind us we have not just rights and responsibilities, but ignoring these or overusing them gives us consequence.
The other issue is that there's nowhere really to hide during an election campaign. Whenever it comes to that, you can't just run away or not do media conferences during an election campaign. And Peter Dutton has been very prominent in the media over the past year. There's absolutely no question about that. But it's mainly the smash and grab types of performances where he gets his main talking points across, he avoids questions and then leaves the scene. And you just cannot do that during an election campaign. And Albanese is being perceived as weak at the moment. And to be honest, he has been weak in quite a few areas. But he's been under sustained and hostile media pressure over the past 6 months. But that's a little bit like a training ground for an election campaign, you pick up the experience in dealing with these situations. If you're dealing with all of this pressure in the lead up to an election campaign, well, that means that you are fully prepared for when the election campaign actually arrives. And Dutton is avoiding all of those experiences, which would actually, I think, benefit him during a campaign. So if you like, he's turning up to an election campaign and he's not going to be match fit. He's going to be unfit. And it's likely that he'll crack under the pressure that comes from a campaign because he just hasn't been doing any of those hard media conferences or submitting himself to the very difficult media interviews. And he does have the cover of the media, there's no question about that. The ABC is almost like a Peter Dutton news broadcasting channel, and a lot of the ABC audience have complained about Peter Dutton and the Liberal Party being just given so much airtime at the ABC, and that's fallen on deaf ears. There's all of those puff pieces on commercial television and Sky News, and that's undoubtedly going to continue over the next 5-6 months or so. So the influence of mainstream media or legacy media has dropped off, but it's still there. It's just a question of how much influence it will have over the next 6 months and whether this support for Peter Dutton, which has almost been 100%, will make any difference to the final election result next year.
The public listen to the press when the public agree with the press. So the Voice gets up because the press doesn't support it, essentially. Nobody cared what Peter Dutton thought. And the public wanted to agree with the press because the press were able to couch it in, oh, look, we've got Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine don't agree with the Voice and they're Indigenous. And it means that the Indigenous community must be divided, and it must be a bad thing because those two unrepresentative voices disagree with it. So I can feel good in voting against it too. Of course, the second it's over, Jacinta Price says, oh, maybe we should have a voice to Parliament, without really understanding that she'd campaigned for months against it, causing untold damage to her people, both as a collective but also individuals. But people were happy, not us of course, to listen to the press because it agreed. Peter Dutton's approval rating hasn't moved an inch, despite every single ABC story, it seems, starting with Peter Dutton says, nobody cares what he thinks, and the more you promote this, the less people will care. And I think that that's a big thing to remember.
There's also the role of the independents in the lead up to the next election campaign, and we recently had the Liberal Party member for Bradfield, Paul Fletcher, announce that he's not running at the next election. And David, he must have listened to our previous episode about his chances at the next election and then decided not to run. So that just shows you how influential we are in federal politics, and we can't say for sure at this stage, but it just means that the seat of Bradfield is more likely to fall to the community independent candidate, Nicolette Buller. And there will be more independents running at the next election, and they mainly seem to be targeting Liberal Party held seats. There's also more alternative candidates for the Senate as well, people such as Jordan Vandenberg, also known as Purple Pingers, running for the Victoria Socialists. So there will definitely be more candidates running at the next election, and there will be more announced as we get closer to the election. But there has been a drift away from the major parties over the past 40 years, and I think that's likely to continue at the next election.
Every election you lose people. They get sick of it, they get sick, they age out, they realise that they've done as much as they possibly can and they're never going to be Prime Minister or proceed further through the ministry. They get caught out, either publicly or privately, doing things that used to end political careers. Some of them read the writing on the wall and realise that they're going to be spending time or more time in opposition. By the looks of it, Paul Fletcher spoke to his local community. He held a community forum, and it was the next day he's announced he wasn't standing anymore. I don't think he's a massive loss to the Australian Parliament, but it seems that not only did he run this, he listened to the community and realised he wasn't going to win. Whatever they told him, probably, I'm not voting for you and you're not going to win. And so instead of pouring Liberal Party resources into an unwinnable situation, he has done the best thing for the party and stepped down. So credit where it's due. Again, the indications that I've seen is that they're going to put in a fairly moderate female candidate. And if this happens, that's showing that at least some in the party, in New South Wales anyway, are listening. And that's a good thing too.
But I think it's also more a case of what's happening in Bradfield could also happen in quite a few other Liberal Party held
for
seats
sure.
in inner city areas.
For sure. Bradfield was one of the few metropolitan Sydney areas with a Liberal. There's a couple more. Morrison's old seat. Cook is still held by a Liberal, although the Labor Party down there is confident of actually winning the seat. I don't think it'll go to Labor, but again, a strong Teal candidate or a strong independent just might take it off Liberal hand. There are no safe seats. I think that's fair to say. Even those seats that seem safe, it's only an election cycle. They're not safe anymore. So there'll be pressure on candidates to stay. Ego, self-preservation, pride, and more generous feelings like trying to save resources, trying to do the right thing for the party will open up a floodgate of resignations. The other unsaid thing is the unpopularity of Dutton within the party. And so far he's been fine. There's been no serious challenge to him, partly because for some reason there's no obvious replacement, which probably shows how dire things are. But all it'll take is one major gaffe where he oversteps the line in the wrong way and the sharks will circle. He's not embattled yet, and he's not under pressure yet, or any of those embattled, under fire and all of those, but it mightn't be much to change it to that. Of course, they're not going to do very much before an election unless he steps down of his own volition.
So that's it, not just for today's episode, but for the entire year. And it also completes 7 years of the New Politics podcast. And the median number of episodes for all podcast show is 1 episode. That's the median number. And we've made over 300 episodes, so we must be doing something right. So we have to give a big thank you to all of our supporters and all of our listeners in the general audience throughout the year, and all of our paid subscribers and donors on Patreon and Substack. Without your support, we just wouldn't be able to produce the New Politics podcast. So thank you very much for your support. And to all of those people who abuse us relentlessly, we've decided to replicate the Christmas Day truce of 1914 and say that all is forgiven just this once. But without listeners, it doesn't matter who you are, we cannot survive, even the listeners who do abuse us. We're not as big as the Joe Rogan experience, but we will get there. And to you, David, thanks for all of your work this year. It's been a pleasure working with you yet again.
Straight back at you, Eddie. I've thoroughly enjoyed doing this. We've written 2 books this year. For those of you who read them, thank you. I hope you enjoyed them. I'd like to acknowledge those who aren't doing so well. No matter your circumstances, things will get better. And for the people of Palestine and for people with family in Palestine and the rest of the Middle East, our thoughts are with you, and we hope that that settles down very soon. And the same for all oppressed and attacked people.
And we will be having a break for most of January. We'll still be publishing our regular articles and essays on Substack and Patreon, but the New Politics podcast will be having a short break. Now, it might not seem like it, but it's a lot of work putting together a weekly podcast, and we've also published the 2 books this year as well. So we have been very busy, but we do need to have a rest. So we do wish all of the best to our audience. The Christmas and holiday period is always a good time to relax, but as David suggested, it's also a time to think about all the people who are less well off or doing it tough for whatever reason, whether it's here in Australia or anywhere else in the world. But whatever you end up doing, enjoy the break, and we'll see you again next year.